Hey there. So, digital video, as all of you know, video consists of a series of frames, right? And it may be at a variety of different frame rates. And most of the time, what you're doing, however you're generating footage for your Machinima films, you're generating video. Maybe it's an MP4 or some other format, but it's some kind of a video file. You're bringing that into your editor, and then you're applying effects or color correction or filters and altering the look of that footage, right? And most of the time, that's all you really need to do. But sometimes you'd like to do something a little bit special, where you're actually tinkering with the frames of the film itself, typically outside of your video editor. You actually want to have it as a series of images at whatever frame rate that you're working with. This is typically referred to as an image sequence, right? So if you're generating some footage in iClone, for example, you can render that out as an image sequence. Now, the method most people use is you're either rendering a still image of something, and you're picking what your shot is of where you want the rendered frame to happen, or you're rendering a video, which is a sequence of frames with animation happening, right? Well, you can also render out as an actual sequence of images. If you click on image, and then after you've chosen your format, which could be JPEG or PNG is my favorite, mainly because PNG has the ability to store transparency information, which can be helpful if you're doing layering and things like that. But all you do is, instead of rendering just the one frame, you're going to choose sequence. And then you set your frame rate, whatever you want it to be. You set your dimensions, the frame size. And then after that, the render settings are pretty much the same as they would be elsewhere. Your how much anti-aliasing do you want? And, all of those settings related to tweaking the way that it looks coming out of the program, right? So that's handy if you're using iClone. But what if you've got footage from some other source? Maybe you've created some video from Grand Theft Auto, or maybe you've used OBS to capture some footage from The Sims or something like that, right? And what if you want to do frame at a time type stuff on that, where you're starting not with a set of images like iClone might be able to spit out, but you're starting with a video file. So what we're going to do is cover we're going to split this up into multiple sections here. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to get from having a piece of video that you want and how to get that into the image sequence form and some of the factors related to that. One of which is disk space. You need lots of disk space for this. In all likelihood, much, much, much more disk space than you would need for the equivalent video file. Much, much more. Because in most video formats, there's some kind of compression, right? And what compression does is it, like in this sequence here, if we just look at the way that this looks on the screen, if I can get it to operate properly. Yeah, it's kind of making my webcam stagger, so I'm going to turn off the webcam for a second here. So you'll notice that in a sequence like this, not everything on the screen changes in every frame that goes by. Some stuff changes, but some stuff is the same. There's quite a bit of change in this one because there is a moving light that's going with the character, but there are aspects of between the different frames where not a lot has changed. And so what video compression does is it actually finds a way to conserve the space for that and account for it. When you're exporting as an image sequence, every single frame is an image, and there's no compression benefit at all. So I say all that to say, have plenty of disk space to do something like this. Okay? So we're going to hop over to DaVinci Resolve and talk about how to get this done in there. Your video editor may or may not be able to do this, or if you do, it's done a different way, but DaVinci Resolve, what I like about it, first of all, it's super powerful. But secondly, there is a free version of it. And the free version can do this. So if you even just needed to use a different editor to do this step, you could do so and then switch back to whatever you prefer using. All right, so let's dive into Resolve. Okay, so we've started a new DaVinci Resolve project, and we're going to hop over to the Edit tab. We'll skip the first two, the Media and the Cut tab, because we're just dealing with one clip here. This is nice and simple. And I'm just going to drag our short little clip right onto the timeline. Now, when you bring in a new piece of footage to a new timeline in DaVinci Resolve, it's going to ask you, do you want to change the project frame rate? Okay, since we didn't go in and specify a frame rate ahead of time, and we haven't really thought about that yet, we're going to go ahead and tell it to change it, just so the frame rate of this timeline matches the film. That may not end up being ideal for what we want to do long term, but I'm doing this strategically because I want to be able to show you something about how this works. So now that we've done this, this timeline that shows up here, called Timeline 1, it's the only one that exists. The timeline just refers to kind of a group of footage on the timeline. You can have multiple timelines in a project. But when you create a timeline, through whichever method you create a timeline in DaVinci Resolve, the frame rate is locked. Once you put a piece of footage on the timeline and you've been forced to make a decision about that, you can't change it. So what that means is if we right click on this timeline and go over to timeline settings, it's kind of gray here, so it may not be super easy to see, but you're going to see that, okay, the timeline resolution, which is my project default, was 1920 by 1080, and the frame rate is 60. Now we can tell it, don't use the project settings, and then we could alter this timeline resolution if we wanted it to be 4K or something like that, right? But we can't change the frame rate. Now, why does that matter? Well, if we hop over to the Deliver tab, which is where you do your rendering, and we go to set up a rendering job for this project, if you look under frame rate here, yeah, you can't change it. This is something that kind of flummoxes DaVinci Resolve users sometimes when they're first getting used to the program. So what do we do about that? Well, let's go back over to the Edit tab. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new timeline. Now, if you've already laid out a bunch of clips and things like that, then this is going to feel scary. But don't worry, this is non-destructive. But we're going to create a new timeline. We're going to right-click in here, choose Timelines, Create New Timeline. And we'll just keep the default name of Timeline 2. But what we're going to do is we're going to uncheck Use Project Settings, and that's going to open up a whole bunch more tabs here for us. And the one that's relevant for our purposes here is Format. So here is where we can set the timeline resolution to whatever you want. I'm going to leave it at 1080p like it is right now, but you could set this to whatever your final destination output is going to be. And then the frame rate, look at that. We've got all the choices that DaVinci Resolve offers us here. So we're gonna actually do what we're going to be doing with our frame at a time processing on this clip is we're going to be changing it into something that's a little bit more cartoonish, a little bit more that looks more like traditional animation than it does, a 3D rendered thing. So we're gonna go ahead and drop the frame rate down to 24. You could go even lower than that with certain types of animation if you want to. And that means that for every second of video that we render from here, there's going to be 24 images, 24 frames. So you set this according to what you want to do. So now we click Create, and we've created a new timeline. Now immediately our clip goes away. So if you had a bunch of stuff already on your timeline, that's really scary, right? Well, don't worry. You've switched from timeline 1 to timeline 2 right up here at the top. If we go back to timeline 1, there's our clip, and if you had multiple clips, whatever. So what you can actually do is you can select everything from one timeline, copy it, then go to your new timeline and paste it in here, and it will paste that. Now, I'm not going to do that here because I'm just going to drag in the footage right here to right down there, okay? Now, you notice because this was a timeline that we created and specified the settings, it doesn't ask us what we want to do for frame rate like it did the first time, because we specifically mentioned what we want to do. And if we go and look at the properties of timeline 2 here, timeline settings, you can see it shows, okay, we've got 1080p, but guess what? The frame rate's locked in. So frame rate is something in DaVinci Resolve you've got to set early on. All right, now real quickly, I'm going to do a little bit of fiddling with this here, because if we look at the timeline as we drag through here, you know, it's less than 1 second of footage, because it's kind of playing in like a real-time speed. I want a little bit more footage to deal with than that. So I'm going to select this clip. I'm hitting Control R. That's a shortcut for a thing that will let you alter the speed of a clip. So now we can drag this out, and let's have it run at like 30% speed. The reason we can afford to do that is because we know, well, I happen to know, that the source footage here is actually 60 frames per second. So if we stretch it out, it's not going to have to really do very much interpolation to get down to 24 frames a second for our output, because the frames are there. It's just if we left it like this and rendered it at 24, it would just drop frames, right? So we're using that. We've filmed at a higher frame rate than we actually need on purpose. All right, so we can hit Control R again to get rid of that. So now if we drag the timeline here, I'm just looking at this time indicator right here. Now we've got almost 3 seconds of footage, and that's fine for this little test we're going to do. That's going to mean it's going to have a little bit of a slow motion feel, but that's actually okay. All right, so all of that was just kind of preliminary getting set up. Now here's the juicy part. So if we go over to the Deliver tab, and this is where we are defining our render job. So I'm just going to browse to where I know I want this to be rendered. We'll do it right here into this folder named Test, and we're just going to name it Test as well. So this is the file name. This is the path. And then down here are the settings. And what we want to do is we want to look under Video and look at Format. And so in my Resolve, it defaults to QuickTime. I very often, when I'm doing final renders, I'm switching over to MP4. But there's other options in here that you may not look at very often, such as JPEG or PNG or TIFF. We're going to use PNG. I tend to like PNG because the quality is very good. It does not heavily compress anything. And PNG offers the ability to export alpha channel into the PNG images. Now, this scene doesn't have any alpha channel. It's all opaque. But if it did, that would be mighty, mighty handy here. We can just tick that box and it will include alpha channel. We don't need alpha channel for this shot, so we're going to uncheck it. And here's our frame rate, 24. Now, it does give us other options here, but we're going to stick to 24. That's what we planned for. And we're going to keep the resolution at 1080p right here. All right? So you'll notice that audio gets grayed out when we have selected an image type. That's because obviously you can't store audio in images, right? When you do an image sequence, you're not bringing your audio with you. Just something to be aware of. All right, so we add this to the render queue, and you'll notice if you look up here on the file name, there's our path. renders test is what it was on my computer. And then test was the file name that we put in over here on the left. And then there's a sequence number, which is showing you basically what the first frame is going to be. Now, I can't remember where it gets this counter number, but it doesn't matter. As long as it's going to export them in a logical, a numeric sequence, it's fine. And they're going to be uniquely named. Okay? So if we say render all, it's going to render a series of images that looks like this, but it's going to increment that value of the number up as it goes. So we'll just hit render. And then if we go over to the folder test that we chose as our path, there's our images. Okay. So this is essentially this is the video, but it's rendered one frame at a time as an image sequence. And if we just pick one and just open it up in our image editor, you'll be able to see what it looks like. And the quality is great. I mean, the quality is the same quality, and if not better, than what the video would have been because there's no compression going on. Each frame gets rendered one at a time, just like what we were showing out of iClone, really. Now, with DaVinci, of course, it's getting rendered one frame at a time based on the settings and codec and such that we've set over here. And there's some ways to tweak that are pretty advanced. We're not going to deal with that in this video. But that is the image sequence. Now, in the next video, we're going to demonstrate some of the different things that can be done with this image sequence that you can't necessarily do quite the same way using video plugins or filters or color correction or things like that. There's things that you can do once you've got it in frame form like this. But you can see, by the way, this is 66 frames, just 66 frames, and it weighs 169 megabytes. And that's going to vary because, you know, it depends somewhat. These vary in size. Here's one that's 1.92 megabytes, one of the first ones, and most of it's dark. If we get to where more things are lit up or there's more detail, that image is 2.89. So it varies. So there is some compression that goes on with PNG, but it really does a good job of preserving the quality. I think TIFF has even less compression, which means the files will be much larger. JPEG generally has more compression to the point where it sometimes displays artifacts, but you conserve file size greatly. So for the purposes of the testing that we'll be doing in the coming videos, it doesn't matter which of those formats you chose, but if you don't want to follow along exactly with what I did here, then just choose PNG. So in the next one, we are going to dive into what can we do with these now. We'll see you then.